Here we are, back to Podcastville.
Yes, we are. I like the cadence we have, having our work throughout the week and having our interactions and coming together over these wonderful topics. It seems that there's comfort in things that are going to be the same all the time, but we know that's not the reality. And I was looking forward to talking to about our subject today. It talks about change and how change occurs, but also at the same time, how we can help the people and the groups and the organizations around us manage that change for better or worse.
So, is this I'm trying to think, is this the 12th of the 12 principles that are outlined in PMBOK 7?
Yes,
All
enabling
right.
change to achieve the envisioned future state. So this is the key. This is the key. Enabling change to achieve tomorrow. Okay. So this implies that there is a very well-defined and a very well-selected future. The way they phrase it in the PMBOK is very calculated and very analyzed in order to achieve what we can in the best of all possible manners.
So we're talking more than just keeping a CR log, a change request log.
Oh yeah. Think about this. Okay.
Yeah,
I
why
I
don't you
was
kick us off?
some of the engineers I worked with were all master's degree and above when I was in consulting. And they followed a very specific pattern. Um, they said, here we today, here's where we want to be tomorrow based on the client, based on the product owner, and based on everybody else. And if anything happens, we're going to go back to this. I remember working with one person, and it wasn't that she was adamant that that future state was going to be the future state, but she was adamant in both working with the team and also working directly with the client that we need that idea of a future state in order to make sure that that change is moving in the right direction. And that's when I said, that's what we mean by controlling and managing change. Not necessarily saying yes or no or rejecting or deferring. It's actually saying we have a good idea of the direction and we have a set of tools that have worked well in the past that actually help us keep on track. And that actually set me forward, not just in project management, but everything. This was a model for everything that I actually looked at, whether it was unknown work or whether it was predictable work.
But it's interesting because I had an old boss who once told me, he said, it's better to have a goal and miss it than not to have a goal and hit it. So I think what you just recounted to me reminded me of that, because with the future state in mind, that's your goal. And even if change comes along the way so that you miss that exact future state, you're still going to hit something, rather than
Yeah.
not having a goal or not having a future state in mind, and then you're not quite sure where you're going to end up.
And that's the whole premise of change control and change management right there. It's we may not hit this goal, but if we don't, we know why and we agree. Exactly.
And we end up with a product that works for us.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it may not be the exact future state we envisioned. Oh, I like that. I like that.
Yep.
So let's get this kicked off from rather than just project management based, because we typically broaden our horizons on these discussions that we have every Friday. But let's talk about the fact that business itself, can a business remain relevant if it doesn't sort of take into account change that may come along?
I have one of my favorite PDFs I share with a lot of my students out of the New York Times in 1951. They were discussing the fact that the train system in 1951 was transitioning from carrying people to carrying goods. And they were saying it's the end of an era and we're going to miss out on everything everybody had. And the author said, wait, if they don't do this, the whole industry of transportation by train is going to go away. It has to change.
Yeah.
It's like change or you disappear. Now, I've talked to a lot of corporations over 100 years old, and they've said they face the same concept twice or three times. The blessing and the curse of project management is that projects are often the way businesses choose to make these changes.
Well, I've got so many things are flying through my mind right now, but the last thing you said was, can you imagine how prescient we would be if we could say, this is how the project is going to go. I'm going to develop my schedule and we're not going to vary from it. And at the end of the time that we have put in place, we will have the exact product that we envisioned. And some of my projects, by the way, were 4 years long. Can you imagine envisioning something that 4 years from now would be exactly as you envisioned it? That's impossible. You have to deal with change along the way.
Yeah, science proves out that's impossible.
Yeah.
Humans are organic, and humans and their tools are the results of organic activity. We have to realize that being part of nature, we are, and business as being part of who we are, reflects this nature. Change is adaptation in the face of, emerging or new constraints.
Yeah, my wife and I like to go to Hawaii on vacation. We do it quite often. In fact, we used to live on Oahu. And when we do go back, we often go to our favorite mall called Ala Moana Mall. So for people who are listening to us, they're probably familiar with the Ala Moana Mall. But what was there for years and years and years as an anchor store was Sears. What happened to Sears? I think probably it didn't keep up with change. And as a result, we don't see much Sears. I mean, I miss the Sears Christmas catalog that used to come to our door every year.
Yeah, I remember that too, that fondly. But at the same time, we regret these things that used to be there, but we realize that, there are things that are of higher value that have replaced them, or they would still be there.
Well, I'm going to ask you a question now that's still on the same topic, but I know you love reading as much as I love reading. One of my favorite activities was to go into the local bookstore and sit there with a book and just smell the pages and smell. But now we have Amazon and we have other vendors that are online. And so we get our books quickly, but we don't get a chance to sit there and maybe sip a coffee and smell a book. How did that change affect you when it happened?
Well, in two manners. Number one, I stopped going to all bookstores and I went to the niche bookstores or the bookstores that catered to the very people who like to sit down and smell the books and magazines.
Yeah.
There's a very famous book chain that usually has a coffee shop inside it. And they actually built their whole model around what you're liking, preserving that experience of smell and texture. But then I also realized that I can have any book that I need in a week, in 3 days, in 1 day, or even in 5 seconds, if I really want to. I'm not as fond right now of electronic books, but I see their efficacy and their ability to do pretty much everything paper books do. It's not that I feel I can't go back to that old experience. It's that I sense that there's more options now. And as long as there's more options, I'm okay with this change.
Yeah, that's true. But I think this long discussion has come to us in a resounding fact that no, a business cannot stay relevant without change. In fact, I remember someone telling me that the only constant in business, and I'll extrapolate this to the only constant in project management, is change.
Yep, that's right. And that actually leads us to a really good question. Are projects the process that business change? Are they change agents? And if they are, what does that mean to you?
Well, I guess I look at it from two ways. Sometimes they are change agents. In other words, let's say, and I've done a lot of government work, so I can speak from that experience. So legislators come up with a new program, and the only way to enable that program or to implement it is through a automation project. So as a result, in a situation like that, yes, very much so that the project becomes an agent of that change. Again, that's that future state, and the only way to enable it is through automation. But on the other hand, I can see a situation where along comes automation and people say, wait a minute, we can use that in this way. And in that aspect, it's sort of like you're using something that already exists to enable something that you are now just envisioning. And I'm thinking, for example, some of the social media, and I'll talk about Facebook as an example. I never thought of getting on Facebook ever until someone told me how to market using Facebook. It never dawned on me. So Facebook existed, but I used it to change my approach to market my company. So I think you can look at it from both ways. One, it's an enabler, and one, it's an agent.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the beautiful thing. And they do exist to support a very, very successful way of managing change in order to, focus activities and resources and people and money to have something happen with a high probability of outcome.
Say that last part again, with a high
probability of outcome.
Okay. Yeah.
Basically, that it's a successful way of delivering change, because you're putting somebody in charge of it. You're putting somebody who's proactive enough to actually manage the work in such a way they're overseeing the schedule and the budget and the scope and the quality and the risk and everything else, and they're making sure that that's either going to hit the target or better.
So let's take another example. You and I have kind of brushed against AI, artificial intelligence, over several of our podcasts. In a lot of our projects, I never ever even really thought about AI. Now, we did use a sort of AI, early adoption of AI, say in some of our customer service processes that we built into our systems. But I never really thought of AI. Well, now comes along this very strong approach to artificial intelligence. Is that a situation, do you think, where we can use AI to create projects to do something different than had been envisioned in the first place?
Let's you and I actually think about this through. AI, artificial intelligence, has existed since the 1970s. I remember studying in college something called the Hebbian learning reflex, which was discovered in neuroscience in the human brain in Canada, of all places. Now,
my alma mater.
There you go. And it's fascinating. If you actually use a set of neural pathways multiple times, connecting neural cells, it strengthens itself and it grows just like every other muscle in your body. Now, what if you could actually do the same thing in a computer system with a database? If you actually have people who are asking the same question and are asking it in a similar way, what's the priority of the information that you're going to deliver? It's going to be weighted based on successful responses to what was delivered earlier. And we've been using our understanding of the function of the human brain, like I said, since the early 1970s. And so in one way, we've had AI. Now, what has happened, the major change in AI is no longer is it a bunch of pieces. It's an assistant. It's a totally disembodied technical and analytical assistant that we can use to call in very, very complex questions. And it can pull things together in a rather successful way and sometimes an unsuccessful way to help us understand not just the answer, but the context, which may even be more important.
And I think from that perspective, I think it goes back to what I was trying to get to, even with my Facebook example, is now we have this new technology that becomes an enabler of new end goals in what it is that we're trying to do, as opposed to us trying to create an AI. AI is helping us create new things. So I think there's two sides of that same coin, where projects are agents of change and projects are also enablers of changes. It's a great world that we're living in right now.
We're living in a world of miracles, and we have been for the last 3 centuries.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. It really is. That brings us into another question here. So when we actually push change to its limits, like we're in lockdown and the entire corporation has to work remotely within 24 hours. That's when we pull out our Agile toolkit. Okay. Now, the Agile, it has a unique approach to change, and I really appreciate the fact that you've actually been placed in the middle of Agile work. From your experience, what's the difference between change management in predictive or traditional projects, and what's the difference between that and Agile projects?
I think in many ways they're exactly the same, meaning that there's going to be a disruption to sort of your flow, whether you're doing Agile or whether you're doing predictive. Now, from a process point of view, predictive, that's something I'm more used to. I spent over 30 years doing predictive type work in terms of methodology. And so in those situations, we had very formal processes for how do we identify a change, how it is that we document it, how it is that we bring it up before the change control board, how it is that we prioritize it to avoid disruption to the project, while at the same time understanding that whether we implement that change before we implement the entire system or after the entire system, it becomes a very strong discussion point amongst all the leaders. But nonetheless, you're still trying to stick with that original plan that was prepared well before the project started. In Agile, what I found, and again, my experience in Agile is certainly much less than the predictive. But in Agile, what I found is that a lot of times when a change was introduced during a sprint, it was added to the backlog so that we wouldn't lose momentum in the current sprint. And yes, there was still a change control board. Yes, there was still prioritization. But in dealing with that particular change, we may add another sprint towards the end, or we may save it until after implementation. But, so there's differences and there's similarities. I think in Agile, though, we didn't want to disrupt the momentum that we had going with the Agile process.
I like that. Because your answer talked about the functionality of change management and change control, but it also talked about the spirit and the reason and the purpose for change management. And the purpose is the same between the two. What's resonated with my students a lot is building the concept of change management and a change control system in a predictive project. It runs alongside. When you look at Agile is thoroughly integrated. I'm not saying it's better or worse. I'm saying it's different. where it's built into the attitude, which is the character of a person in a group, plus the tools and that are brought in. And the specific tools that we look at when we look at change management are the ceremonies that Scrum bring us, like, right, the stand up and the review and the retrospective. And it's the process of how people work together, plus the ceremonies and how they're structured, such that, like you said, the change is part of how the work is done.
I also find that I think managing change in a predictive process is a little more difficult, because what's happening is you're having to make decisions along the way that are, for example, how much do I have to throw away that I've already done in order to incorporate this new change? With in my experience with the agile process anyway, is because you're doing it in small sprints, you can probably catch the change earlier and make the change sooner if you need to make that change. And like you were saying, in sort of a more of a modular fashion than this whole integrated approach and retesting and recoding and redesigning and reanalyzing and all that sort of thing. So again, which one would I prefer? I prefer predictive, but that's because I've done it for over 30 years.
Right. And if you get into the nuts and bolts, and like I said, in future shows, we may want to do this, it can be shown that human behavior is much more like an agile approach to life, where predictive was built with a purpose in mind. And so I believe that predictive methodologies are there for a very, very good reason. It's just that from time immemorial, since I've been a project manager, we've only looked at project management in one method. And one of the things that I really, really enjoy is seeing how PMI is integrated, Agile, the mindset, and the set of methodologies is being integrated into the whole constellation of project management tools.
Yeah, and in some ways, something you just said, and I'm probably going to get some hate mail for this, but in some ways, my experience with predictive, again, has been changes there in order to allow you to develop the full set of requirements by date certain. Agile certainly has, a lot of projects have date certain, but it's much easier to leave functions out because it's so modular. And as you say, there's so much of a mindset that you're sort of building as you go along. And so therefore, it's much, in my mind anyway, it's much easier to sort of say, we need this, but we can live without this. Whereas in predictive, if it's not all there, sometimes it's difficult to implement the entire system at that time.
I think this bears future analysis. And I think we could actually have very challenging and difficult, but very enjoyable conversations in these areas.
Yeah. So do you think, we're talking about change. Have you ever been on a project where there's too much change, perhaps? I've never been on a project where there's not enough change.
Right.
That has never happened. But have you ever experienced too much?
Oh yeah.
What happens?
Well, there's two areas where I've seen this. Number one, where people are not forecasting their ability to complete work accurately, and they're not assessing risk in the right manner. In predictive methods in a traditional project, that leads to disaster, because you're going to have incredible amounts of recovery, as well as, you're basically going to build from scratch what you can do if you're not careful. On the other end, signs of the times. Look at the world environment. All corporations are struggling with this. they're saying we want our employees to work inside the office. And at the same time, our budgets and our profits and our revenues are shrinking. And at the same time, our supply chain is unstable. And at any moment, we have to make a decision. And this is impacting projects like we can't believe. And I think this may be one of the factors that's driving a lot of corporations to research the applicability of Agile in their work environments.
Well, and I think you said it best a little while ago in this podcast, and that was that, we're part of the organic system. Humans are organisms, and humans they can go the straight line, or they can go different ways to get to the same accomplishment. What it is, though, is we can't cookie cutter every single human being to do exactly the same thing. And some of the projects that I've been on where we've experienced what I would call too much change are because we had a project manager on either side, the client side or our side, who was very much a creative and not as much an implementer. And so what's the idea of the day? And, we ended up with some very creative solutions, but here's what happens. It throws the project into chaos. Mm-hmm. Because you never know from one day to another if you're going to have to undo something you were doing last week, or if you're going to do something new that wasn't on the plan, or you never want to get away from the plan. You never want to get away from good project management principles. But there are those creatives, or there are those legislators, or there are those policy people, or there are those procedures people that want to say, why don't we do this? Why don't we do this? And a team that's sort of, think of and I'm going back to my grandfather's day, think of a team of horses all pulling at the same time. But if you suddenly put another horse on there that decides to go left when everybody's going right, it causes chaos. And that's some of the issues that we're dealing with too much change.
And it can happen at any level of the project. I remember working actually exploring work in another state. And I was talking to the state CIO and what his vision was. And he said, my vision is to employ a framework like there's this Unix framework called Corba at the time. It's gone the way of tools that don't apply in most business environments since then. But he said, it'll solve all our problems. All we have to do is get a tool in place and we'll be fine. If we get the tool right, everything will follow. And when that happens, you get a tool in place and all of a sudden you find gaps or you find missteps and another change occurs and you make another change. And pretty soon, the amount of bandages to the solution are greater than the mass of the solution itself.
Well, if you've ever had the privilege of maintaining procedural code after it's been in place for about 10 years, the term spaghetti code does not even do that justice.
Yeah.
It ends up being exactly like that. So,
yeah.
When I was talking about we people being human organisms, organisms, yes. The other thing is we can only keep so much, no matter how good our systems are, we can only keep so much detail in our head or on paper. And at some point, if we allow too much change to occur, we're going to get ourselves all tied up in knots and have the team frustrated. And again, I go back to that word chaos.
Yeah, it's 3 to 5 objectives. It's 3 to 5 risks. Yeah. It's 3 to 5 issues. If not, we're going to be dealing with the effect of bringing a small child into Baskin Robbins here in the United States and having them choose from 31 flavors of ice cream. It doesn't work. It's a non-functional solution.
And if you have double scoop, you got 31 times 31 possibilities. So here's another question though. How did you, in situations like that, did you have any kind of techniques to deal with kind of reining in the change?
This is where integration comes in. A lot of the change is at a lower level, and some of the changes are at the big level. And so I can actually say, is this a big change to the objectives, or big change to the purpose, or a big change to what we're trying to do as a whole? Or is this a functional, systematic, or procedural change that's going to have influence? And these are the things that we hopefully capture early in our assessment of change requests.
Yeah, we had something very similar. And obviously we're going to talk a little bit about change management versus change control, but you put those processes in place and leadership in place that are committed to obviously making sure that change is prioritized, but also mitigated. But also what we used to do very cleverly, because, follow the money, money talks. We would also put the client would often put an upward bound on the amount of money they were willing to spend on change. And so naturally, that bound you, the developer, the deliverer of the project, to just a certain amount of person hours to be able to affect that change. So, there are practical ways besides just process to keep the amount of change left. Because after all, if you deliver a system that has most of the functionality in a timely manner to make it available to your end user, even if you don't have some of the bells and whistles, no matter how essential they are, until you add them on later, you've still delivered something that is worthwhile. And so that's part of this whole change management, change control argument that we put in place as project managers.
There has to be boundaries. In Agile, the intent is to have wide boundaries at the beginning of the project and close those boundaries. Mm-hmm. In traditional projects, there is a path to follow. And you do, when you have these alerts that say, we have some federal laws being changed, or we have this organization who has reorged, and we need to look at things. And you have to have a way to actually, number one, gather that, number two, assess it, number three, apply what you need, and capture what you won't, and then to make sure it's successful as you move forward. And you're right. I've thought about this a lot myself. In predictive projects, it's an art to have this change going on as you're doing the project without bothering the flow, where in Agile, you don't have those issues.
Or certainly not as much. I just picked up my smartphone, and I've got one of the latest versions of this particular manufacturer's smartphone. And just as you were talking, I was thinking, what if the vision was this version 10 years ago? It would never have been invented or produced. It would never have been produced.
Right.
Whereas putting something out that was usable, learning from those users, adding new functions, learning from those new functions, adding some more functions, so you come up with this particular piece of art. And I don't care which manufacturer it is, they are great products. But had they gone for this version way back 10 years ago, we would have never had a good version, because it would have been too much.
I remember talking to the director of an investment firm. I was helping them sway the board of directors of the corporation to invest in a little more costly workstation. And he said, I've looked at your numbers, Tim. That 26% return on investment over 3 years, year over year, is not bad. But you know what? You're leaving a lot of money on the table. What if our solution is actually able to control the power that was going into that office, and we were able to do the same type of work in a way that we could actually drop the power usage of that computational capability? You'd be looking at 150 and 175% return on investment. And on the back of a cocktail. Not only did we give him what he and his board of directors were dreaming of, but it actually sent 3 of our sales reps to Tahiti with bonuses the next year. It was amazing. And without the ability to assess and understand the impact of a potential change and really give even the crazy ideas a little bit of attention, we wouldn't be able to make these changes.
Oh, that's exactly right. Hey, I have a different slant on this, Tim. You know, we've been talking about projects that exist and changes that happen. Do we have situations, or can you think of how we could address the fact that change being considered the reason for the project to exist in the first place?
Oh, yeah. You remember 9/11, of course, in the United States, where we had to retrofit all of our public-facing facilities within a matter of, what was it, 2 or 3 weeks, with the requirements that the federal government gave us. Oh, yes, I'm very, very familiar with these type of projects.
Well, I was just even thinking when COVID hit, when the pandemic hit here, I had just completed my part on a project where there was probably 200 to 300 people on staff on site. And suddenly all of these people had to stay home and yet be productive. And the change that was almost like a project within the project, to be able to enable those people to continue to contribute, even though they weren't together on the same floor. And we were able to manage that in 2 to 3 days through some of the other processes that happened. So yeah.
Let's compare our experiences, okay? So I've been teaching remotely since 2015, right? And a lot of my teaching has occurred when a corporation says, we need this person on site for a week. Can we have them at this date to this date? And so a lot of my communications would be negotiating that type of a training environment. At the time, I was also helping my corporation build investment in remote training, because I was starting to pull 30 people per class to 50 people to 75 people. And all of a sudden, the emergency was declared. Yeah. And then all of a sudden there was no travel. But what happened to my work? My work quadrupled in volume, and it still exists to this day. And I still teach both to consumers, the broad public, as well as select universities and corporations. And it's amazing how this has totally transitioned the whole idea of professional training.
Yeah, so we kind of got on this subject, and we touched on it earlier in the podcast, but if change is the reason for projects to exist, and once that project is in place, there's events and issues that come in and cause change to the project that's already existing, are those managed in the same way?
Well, yes and no. Yes and no. Okay. So let's take a predictive model. We won't go into Agile here, but a predictive model. So, so you have basically a needs assessment, a business case, a project charter, and a plan, right? You have a chain of discussions, decisions, and consensus that say, here's a change. It has happened. We need to respond to it. And therefore, that change is a component of the objective. Okay?
It becomes the project.
Right. It becomes the project. It's the change itself is part of the set of objectives. We are responding to this change. Then, see, here's the thing. In predictive project management, you enable change control once the baselines are in place. Once the baselines are in place, you turn on change control, okay? That's when things get locked in, and that's when you turn on that change control system that actually says, we are receiving all change requests through this machine. Now, here's the thing. That machine is then going to either pick up change requests or unapproved changes or more necessary changes. And it's the mechanism itself now has kicked in. So they are of the same type or same species. They're both changes, but one initiates the project and the other is an instigator of potential chaos, or at the very least, an unknown state. How's that for an answer?
Thought you were going to say, or at the very least, something to try the patience of any project manager. So, and I like what you said about putting it sort of into concrete. Becomes your baseline, because I can tell you, and I don't know if this goes on in every single IT company that's out for profit, but I can tell you that every single bid that I worked on, you bid the best case scenario, and it's almost like you turned the blinders on and said there won't be any change.
That's like saying there's not going to be any risk.
Exactly. So you would lay out your proposal to win the business, but then the client would take that plan that you presented to them in your proposal, and that became your baseline. Now you had to manage to that baseline, and remember, the assumption is that there's not going to be a change, or it's going to be minor, that you can handle. And then along come some of these interesting changes, like the pandemic, like 9/11, like some of these things. And suddenly the change hits in such a way that you have to deal with it. So it does become a little bit, I'd agree with you. You use very much the same processes, but in terms of applying change to an existing project, there's probably a little more finesse involved in managing those changes.
Oh yeah. When I say necessary, we're talking about success or failure of the project, and I'm looking at it as a binary. But yeah, the change control can kick off something as a change in scope or cost or budget or resource or quality or risk or anything, to a wide scale, up and to including a rebaselining of the entire project.
Yeah, and the projects I've been on, typically you end up rebaselining the larger projects that are 2, 3, 4 year projects. We typically would baseline maybe once a year, maybe once every 18 months, but you would have to baseline because things happen, life happens, changes happen, policy changes, that sort of thing. So you end up having to deal with those as you go along.
Yep. I remember learning the earned value formulas, where you have EAC, which is your forecast of your project, the total project budget. Your EAC equals, the work complete, the actual cost, plus a bottom up re-estimation of the rest of the project. And I thought those guys knew what they were talking about.
Well, I remember having my teams do that almost on a weekly basis, because you kind of wanted to keep track, right? And I ended up coming in one week and everybody did their estimate to complete so that I could look at the estimate at completion. And I looked at it, and we'd actually fallen behind after 40 people applied their efforts for an entire week. We were further behind. And so I was very unkind. And to this day, I remember this because I wish I had not said this, but I said, you guys should have just taken the week off, because we'd be better off. We'd be further ahead, which was unkind of me as a project manager. I will never do that again. But yeah, absolutely. And, it all comes down to how it is that we're looking at change, managing change. But you said something, we've been throwing around two terms: change management and change control.
Oh,
can
goody.
we wrap up, as we start to wind down this podcast, can we give a definition for the slight differences between those two terms?
I can start with change control system.
Okay.
Change control is the assessment of change requests, unapproved changes and necessary changes in such a way that they are assessed, they are processed, and they are applied or not in order to maintain the integrity of the project.
No, that's good.
And change management has to do more of a behavioral component, and it's the preparation and the understanding of the impact of change on people, groups, organizations, and work. That's the best way I can actually describe it without going right to a dictionary.
Or to the PMBOK, which has one version, and maybe IEEE has a different, who knows. But no, that's good. So, but change control is the one we tend to focus on because that's the process. Project managers love
we can get our
processes.
hands around it, and we can look at the ins and outs, and we understand it well. Change management is behavioral. And I remember one of my data center projects where the CIO said, we're changing the entire culture of the corporation. We need 7 months to prepare all of our employees, not just from a functional standpoint, but intellectually, emotionally, and psychologically.
And where did he get the 7 months, or she?
From experience.
Yeah.
When they were having major business process changes. Again, this was a company that was somewhere between 125 and 145 years old, and you can imagine they'd made a few mistakes.
Yeah. And a few cultural changes along the way, probably, right?
Oh, yeah.
But maybe that's, and I wish we had another hour, but I think, we keep talking about change in terms of how it affects the project or the reason the project exists. But change is broader than just changes to the system. Change is all encompassing.
And that's the wisdom of PMI, because they do have a change management framework. They have a book on organizational change, and that book exists just for what you're talking about. It's not just changes to the project, but the impact of the project to the context, the business and the environment and the people. And we need to actually, not just do the rules and tools to change requests, but we need to actually consider the implications of these changes. And sometimes it's too complex for us to actually get correct.
Well, and I wish we'd have had organizational change management concept in place when I first started in this industry. One of my very first projects, we were automating a process, and suddenly all of the end user workers were going to have a terminal. We didn't call them computers back then, or PCs. They were terminals. They would have a terminal on their desk that they had to do all of their work now through this terminal. And we ended up with a lot of the, say, seasoned workers saying, I'm done. I'm out of here. Had we had organizational change management in place, we might have been able to predict that and understand how to handle that before we lost half the workforce.
In the future, as we talk about this, there are actual pieces of management of projects and project work such that we can actually articulate how we're going to actually prepare people and organizations, not just affect the change, but actually make it easy for successful change to occur.
Yes. So that way change isn't limited just to the project team effecting something in the code. It really is organizational wide.
Exactly.
So how would we, let's wrap this up. How would we advise a up and coming, budding young manager, project manager who wants to really look at doing a good job on their projects? How would we advise them to be able to grab this whole concept of change and use it effectively on their projects?
Understand how the organization looks at change and how they manage the control of change, whether it's happening to that organization or the organization needs to make a change itself. And then get educated on change control systems and see how they can actually add their approach, their logical approach to change, and then start building a standard approach to all their projects. I would start with change control. And then with that under your belt, you can all start exposing yourself to this wide galaxy called change management.
Yeah. I think what you just said about the change control system, I think that's where it really comes down to. A lot of the other processes, the change management process, the human integration process, the people factors, a lot of those will come as you experience some of these projects. But I think if you have that change control process down pat and implemented on your project such that you truly are taking care of changes as they occur, whether you deal with them there or forestall them for a while, as long as you have that process in place, everything else will come along as you go along. So that's where I would start, change control.
Very wise words, very wise words. So as we do land this plane this week, where can we find you in the next week if we're curious?
If you're curious, you can always reach out to me on good old LinkedIn.
Okay, that's a good start. That's a good start.
I'm literally on LinkedIn every single day. I may not respond to something every day, but I'm on there every day. So
I am curating my account on the weekends. If you want to leave me a message or a question, and we can continue our discussion there. But otherwise, leave it in the comments here. What are we talking about? What do you think? And what would you like us to bring up? And we'd love to consider the topics that you find relevant as well.
And those 14 places where I got tongue-tied today, let me know that you didn't understand something and I'll elaborate. All right, until next time.
Thanks again. I really appreciate this. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in this week.
All right.